Hello and welcome to this opening explorations video. So today I'm going to cover an introduction to the Scandinavian defense. So what is the Scandinavian defense? Well, it begins with e4 by white and then this d4 move, or excuse me, d5 move by black. And immediately black attacks the central pawn of white's here, forcing white to make a decision to defend the pawn, push the pawn, attack the attacker. So if we go back one move here and take a look at after e4 by white, pushing this pawn to the center, what are the most common moves? Well, it looks like pawn to c5 is most common, followed by pawn to e5, the second most common move, or pawn to e6 here, the French defense, pawn to c6, the Caro-Kann. But we're going to cover the Scandinavian, which is pretty far down on the list here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th. The 7th most played move. And in this database, it's only played 45, almost 46,000 times versus almost 800,000 by the Sicilian, and almost 400,000 by the second most played move, e5 here. All right, let's get back to it. This is the Scandinavian defense. So what is best to play against it? If you're white and you have to play against this, well, it looks like by far the most played move is to capture here. Why is that played so often? Well, it's probably the best response. Number 2 is knight to c3. But if you play that, their pawn could push forward, attacking your knight maybe. Or they could just go ahead and capture. So the most played move is to capture. And then that kind of lets white steer the game, because the two options are to recapture with the queen or ignore this pawn capture for the moment. And the number 2 move is to develop the knight, which adds more pressure to the pawn along with the queen. So black can either capture immediately or delay going after this pawn. So we'll look at the top moves first before I go back and look at the less played moves. All right, capture. And now the only downside to this, and a reason why some people don't like the Scandinavian defense, is that white can immediately play the most played move here, which is developing a knight and attacking the queen here. So the queen, of course, has to move. Now, some beginners might want to line up on this half-open e-file and try and check the opponent's king. But then they could just block, of course, with one of their pieces, and it kind of helps you with development. Generally, you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, but black is forced to do that here. And it looks like queen to a5, or d6. These are the most common squares, even all the way back to the starting square, queen to d8. It is possible to play queen to e5 with check, but the most common moves, that's what I'm going to take a look at first. Queen to a5, lining up on your opponent's king, even though there's a knight and a pawn in between for the moment. But now d4 is usually played here, developing your pawn into the center, helping control this important e5 square. Also, the bishop is free to develop. The bishop could maybe go here and line up on the queen, or develop out to f4. Anyway, let's see what the most played move is now by black. Knight to f6. So you develop a knight knights before bishops, that's a general rule or guideline. The knights are slower, and they're almost always well placed on f6 or c6 here for the black knights. And that gives you time to see what you want to do with your bishops later in the game, depending on what your opponent plays. All right, knight to f3, the most played move. So white does likewise, developing the knights first. And then now it looks like c6 is the most common move, followed up by bishop to c4 by white. So this move helps control the center. It lines up on this f pawn, usually a weak spot in your opponent's defenses here, because only the king is protecting that. Of course, this pawn can push forward though and block the scope of the bishop. So here we go. Bishop to f5 is most played by black in this position, kind of eyeing the center and this pawn on c2 here. So the game continues with bishop to d2, freeing up the knight here. So another reason that this move can be played is the possible attack by jumping the knight forward, putting pressure on this along with the queen. So the bishop helps block all of that and prevent the knight from jumping in the center here. So the most played move now is e6, blunting the scope of the bishop, freeing this bishop maybe to move here or even here, putting more pressure on the knight and lining up on the king. So at this point, it looks like knight to d5 is played most often. Is that correct? Interesting choice here. Knight to d5, a discovered attack on the queen. And so queen to d8 is played most often, because now this knight is also threatening to jump here with a fork on rook and king, but now the queen dropping back takes care of that. So now looks like knight to f6 is played most often, and here either the queen can capture or the most played move is this. So the kingside pawns are kind of wrecked. We have doubled pawns here, an isolated pawn here, but the bishop could possibly develop here, kind of aim down through the center. Maybe a rook could go here and line up on our king once we castle. So it looks like bishop to b3 is most common, just dropping the bishop back. Then knight to d7 develops. So I'll play a few more moves. That way you can see how the opening transitions into the endgame. So queen to e2 here, queen to c7. And we notice how white did not castle kingside yet, and probably won't according to these options because of the rook being able to line up on the king. And that could be dangerous. So knight to h4 played most often, attacking the bishop, and here castling, and then castling by black. And then if we go a little bit further, g3, maybe blocking the scope of a rook, lining up on the g file in the future, and bishop to d6. So another reason to play this. It prevents this battery from capturing the h2 pawn. So now capture, the half open h file. So h4 is played to block that rook. And then you get the idea. I won't go much further here. That way we can go back and take a look at some other options in this opening. But a way that you can tell if the opening worked out for you As one way, of course, you're not losing. You didn't lose material and you're not checkmated. But if the game's even and your rooks have landed on decent squares, so here the rooks are connected. This rook is in the center, backing up a pawn that's been pushed forward. The other rook could possibly jump in here, and with the battery, there's a rook queen battery. So it's looking okay for white. Black is pretty safe here, castle to the queen side, and maybe black will fight for this half open d file, maybe bring his other rook here to the center, or keep it here on this half open file. All right, back to the beginning. Let's see here. We'll reset this. Okay. The opening moves for the Scandinavian defense. The pawn has moved here to e4 and pawn to d5, attacking white's pawn. So the most often played move is to capture. So we'll just stick with that. And that's probably the best recommended move, because now you're capturing and you're forcing black to figure out what to do because you're up a pawn now. They could capture with the queen. So we'll look at that one more time here and see what other options are. The most common move will be this, because you immediately attack the queen and force this queen to do something here. We looked at queen to a5 here, and then d4. So I'll make sure there's nothing else that we want to take a quick look at here. Knight to f6. They could play c6 first, but you saw a kind of a pattern of how black wants to set up their pieces and pawns. They're going to push a pawn here, push a pawn here, creating a little bit of space, although it is kind of a cramped position. White developed here, so now this pawn does push forward. White just develops the bishop. Likewise, bishop is developed before you push this pawn forward. It develops outside the pawn chain. So bishop to d2, preventing any knight jumps here piling up on this, because now the knight can recapture and it's not pinned to the king anymore. All right, so e6 is played, and then we saw that knight up to d5 move. So that's a pretty good move to remember. Another option might be just developing the queen off the back rank. And then we have bishop to b4, adding more pressure to this knight. But, if the bishop captures, you'd be giving up your bishop pair, and white could recapture and chase the queen away. So here, it looks like castling queenside, knight develops. Then we have a3, putting the question to this bishop. Will it capture the knight or retreat? So capture, the queen is under attack, retreats back. And now we have knight to e5. So you might notice that the setup in the Scandinavian can a lot of times be similar to the Caro-Kann defense. So if you play the Caro-Kann, you might want to try the Scandinavian, and they could kind of transpose into one another possibly. Some of the themes are similar in the Caro-Kann and the Scandinavian, the way the pawns are set up here. Okay, so we have knight takes e5, pawn recaptures. This knight jumps forward, attacking our bishop. So bishop retreat, which covers all these squares, preventing the knight from jumping forward and harassing our queen. So now castling, queen side by black. So there might be a fight on this open D file in the future. And now G4 chasing the bishop. F4 gaining space. H5 to try and counterattack all this space that white is gaining over here. So H3 fortifying the pawn. And now we have queen to B6. Kind of lining up here, which could be a threat in the future possibly. And a lot of times the king will move to B1 when it castles queenside, so you would be lining up on the king here. All right, what's most played now? Rook at H to F1, which would avoid rook trades here if these pawns are exchanged. So sure enough, capture and capture is most often played. Now black has control of the open H file. And queen to C5, lining up on the king here. So bishop to B3. This frees the queen up from guard duty. It was guarding this bishop when it was here. And now the bishop is also protecting this pawn here. All right, rook to H3, threatening to capture, and the pawn would not be able to recapture because of this pin on the king. So a block here. And then rook at D to H8, doubling up on the open file here. So things have turned out okay for black here. Black's gained control of the open H file. Maybe white could fight for the open D file, although this knight is blocking the D file for the moment. All right, let's drop back here, go back to the beginning and take a look at some other lines. So probably best is just capturing here. And now, before I'll take one more look at this, the queen capturing. So then knight to C3. Where else could the queen go? We'll look at the second most played move, queen to D6. So when this queen's under attack, usually it goes to A5, but it can go to D6. It could have dropped all the way back to where it came from, or even a check here. But if you check, if the queen would have moved to E5 with a check, I don't know, you can just block, develop a piece, block, then maybe bring the knight up, attacking the queen and sending it running again. So, the queen usually goes to A5 because it's off to the side of the board where it's not likely to be attacked as easily. And once this pawn pushes up to C6, the queen has an escape route back to C7 or even back to where it began on D8 here. Okay, so now D4 once again, the most played move, followed by knight to F6, knight to F3, and then here A6, preventing the knight from jumping forward and harassing the queen here. So now we have G3, getting ready to perhaps fianchetto the bishop, and also, maybe prevent any future attacks. If the knight jumped here, they could pile up on that pawn. Of course, this knight is guarding that for the moment. All right, so we have bishop to G4, a pin. And then bishop to G2 helps fortify this knight along with the queen. But there is still the pin to the queen. Knight develops. Oh, so now we have a threat on this pawn. That is ignored in favor of this. And instead of going after this, we have a battery created of rook and queen. So D5 apparently is played most often. All right. d5, knight to e5, bishop to f4, pinning the knight to the queen. But the knight is able to capture anyway because it's a check. So that has to be dealt with. Capture, bishop captures, queen captures, and then this pawn is not captured because maybe a rook could drop over here and pin if the knight were to capture here. So we have e5, the most often played move, blocking this attack on the queen. So yeah, that's another reason why this pawn is not captured, because the queen is under attack. So the capture en passant is most often played. Queen recaptures, and then we have what? Bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Bishop develops here, and I don't know, it looks like open files in the center. The rooks could start fighting for these open files. The bishop could go ahead and capture the knight. And if the queen captures, and you wreck these pawns on the king side, that's one endgame option. But these rooks will probably fight for the open D and E file. Okay, let's take a look back at the beginning after capture. Instead of the queen captures, what about delaying the capture of the pawn in favor of a knight developing to f6? Well, now the most played move is d4. You just develop the other pawn. Forget about this one. You don't try and hold on to this pawn. Capture, knight develops. G6 apparently is played most often. We could look at this bishop pinning the knight move as well. But for the moment, we'll look at the most played move. G6 followed by C4, attacking the knight. Knight drops back, counter-attacking the pawn, but it is protected by the bishop at the moment. So knight develops, bishop develops, putting pressure down through the center and aiming at the queen side. And now we have, let's see here, C5, chasing that knight some more. So knight to the center, bishop piling up, defense by the pawn, and finally white castles, as does black. Rook to e1, bishop to g4, pinning the knight. So bishop to g5, kind of pinning this pawn to the queen. So knight drops back, h3 to chase the bishop, force the bishop to make a decision. So capture, queen captures, capture of this pawn in the center, and attacking the unprotected bishop. So, that is played. And apparently, white won when the queen captures this bishop. So we might want to take a look at that. Usually knight at B to D7 is played. So I'm kind of curious, why is it losing? Or why did the one game where they capture here, why did that not work out? All right, well, we'll go back to that. So for now, this is most often played, followed by the bishop dropping back. Knight captures, or excuse me, bishop captures another pawn. Capture, knight captures, rook captures, and then A to D8, grabbing the open file. Knight attacks, queen to A5, The other pawn is captured. And then rook to d2, rook to f1, and e5. Queen to e5 here. Anyway, kind of an interesting way the game could progress. So let me go back a little bit here and see why they couldn't take, or why it was not wise to take that bishop there. So, you know, what happens if they capture here? Well, in the game we had capture, capture. All right, queen captures. Knight to a6, and then rook captures, knight takes, queen takes, rook at a to c8, block, capture, capture, queen to b4, getting out of that pin, and then rook to b1 because the pawn's also under attack. A6. Another pin of the knight to the queen. So a5 protects the queen. Knight to d5 attacking the queen. Counterattack. And then queen to e5. So this is where, oh, this is as far as we have, and that was the modern Marshall variation of the Scandinavian. All right, let me reset, and we'll take one more look at this before we kind of wrap things up, since this is just an introduction. You know, feel free to leave comments if you'd like me to do a future video and dig deeper into this Scandinavian defense. So probably best for white is to capture, and then black usually captures with the queen, but because they can do this, we'll take another look at that. You know, usually you let this pawn go, they can capture, knight develops, and we'll look at this move, pinning the knight immediately. You can just block with the bishop, e6, castle, bishop to e7, knight is under attack, so drop back and counterattack, but the bishop is protecting. But if we have a capture here and the bishop recaptures, this pawn would no longer be protected. Apparently that's ignored usually. Because you would just give up your bishop pair for a knight and get a pawn. You know, that is a pawn though. Okay, so castling, bishop develops, knight, b3, finally they protect this pawn. F5, gaining space on the king side, but you have this backwards pawn here on e6, which could be a weakness in the endgame. Queen to d2, bishop develops, and now rook at a to d1, maybe getting ready to push this pawn forward. Queen to e7, making room for the rook to move to d8, you know, and line up on the queen. So h3, attacking the bishop. So here we have you know, two options. You give up your bishop pair or you retreat. So, you know, this is probably the better choice. Keep the bishop pair. Here d5, rook at a to d8, because now that pawn is pinned to the queen. Capture, capture, queen up to e3, capture, and the knight captures, attacking here. But we have a capture here, rook captures, and capture. So just a bunch of exchanges here. Finally, this queen is captured. So an isolated pawn in the endgame, which could be a weakness for white. Knight moves forward. Rook grabs the open file. Bishop retreat. Preventing or trying to prevent the rook from grabbing this 7th rank square here. King up, h6, knight. White's turn, knight to d4. So, now if they exchange, it'll just fix these pawns here. So instead, this is played. So now, capture, king attacks. You want to fortify or centralize your king in the endgame. Drops back, and just more exchanges. So bishop kind of lining up on this unprotected pawn. So g3, getting your pawns off the same colored squares as your opponent's bishop is usually a decent endgame strategy. So check, king drops back. You get the idea. I won't go any further. So another example of how the games can turn out in the Scandinavian defense here. All right. That's like a good little introduction. So just remember, if you play e4 and your opponent attacks your pawn with d5, it's usually better for you to just immediately take, and then that forces them to make a decision. Do they immediately capture with the queen, or do they bring the knight out and then try and get this pawn later? And if they do bring the knight out, it's usually better not to try and save this pawn by bringing yours up. I guess we could take a quick look at that. Now what? d4. c4 has been played, so let's see what happens if you try and save that pawn. Now they can attack it immediately with c6 or e6. And now it looks like you don't want to try to hold on to material. So let's see what happens if you do. That just helps them develop a knight. And now black is ahead in development. 2 knights, and all you have is a pawn developed. So knight, then e5, d3. So now there's a possible outpost for this knight, and you have a backwards pawn on d3. So that's why it's usually good not to try and hold on to material. How could it go further? Bishop to c5. Now you're ready to castle as white. So castling, and then h6 limits the scope of this bishop. So knight develops. Bishop attacks this backward pawn. So a3, maybe you're getting ready to attack the bishop and also keeping the knight out of this square. So a5 to prevent this pawn from pushing forward, and knight attacks the bishop. So bishop drops back, bishop develops, and queen up to e7. The rooks are connected, so you can bring a rook here and start piling up on this pawn. Maybe put your other rook here, grab this half open file. And what does white do here? Well, capture, rook captures, knight comes back to the center, rook lines up on the queen, knight attacks, so this rook moves, and then queen up to b3. So rooks prepare to double. Fortification by this rook here, which was not doing much in the corner. So the rooks are doubled, And now knight to h4 attacking the bishop. g3. Queen comes forward. Maybe getting ready to jump a knight in here. If it's captured, the queen could come in there and kind of stick white with this backward pawn, which could be, a weakness in the endgame. All right. Knight retreats. e4. So d4 attacking the queen. Knight captures, and then rook. So after exchanges here, looks like white went on to win here. Anyway, I'm not going to go further. Queen, captured, and white ended up going on to win. So I better wrap it up here. Feel free to leave any comments that you would like. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. And thank you for watching. Have a super chess day.